Thank you all for coming out on a Monday night. I know it's much cooler than it was yesterday and a little breezy out there, so I do appreciate you coming out, especially on a school night. My name is Nicola Penn and I'm the Electorate Business Manager for Zali. I'd like to start off by acknowledging the Brodigal and Camaragal people as the traditional custodians of the land. I pay my respects to elders past and present and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture. I honour the deep history and enduring custodianship of this beautiful part of Warringah and extend that respect to all of First Nations people. So I've worked with Zali since September 2022 and my role is to manage the business of Zali and to ensure that the office runs smoothly. However, Zali sets a cracking pace, and these little legs of mine find it very hard to keep up. We are a small team, but we pack a punch. We all live locally and are motivated to help, advocate and escalate on behalf of the community. We've recently moved offices, as our old building, I'm not too sure whether you came to visit us there, it had a malfunctioning lift, mould on the walls, leaks in the roof, and an aircon that didn't work. Plus it had a DA and it was going to be knocked down and redeveloped. And the government, after 10 years, found us a new home on the Corso next to Coles and NAB, so do please come and visit us. So who's in our team and what does our team actually do? We have constituent liaison officers and grants officers, and they do NDIS, immigration, aged care, social services and grants. We have events, marketing and social media. They create and manage events such as tonight. They do our website, youth ambassador programs, digital media, social posts, etc. We have program and community managers managing Zali's daily program, which is very, very tough because there are lots of people that want to meet with her. Engaging with community groups and organisations, parliamentary events, briefings, stakeholder engagement as well. And we have 2 parliamentary staff members. So there's traditionally sort of 5 EO roles or electorate office roles and 2 parliamentary staff members. So it's quite a small team, but as I said, it does pack a punch. But behind this team is an incredible group of volunteers. We have volunteers that help us on front desk, correspondence, policy, events, market stalls, door knocking, handing out flyers, and they even attend events with Zali as well. And our volunteer numbers are over 1,500 people now. It's quite remarkable. Zali gets about 200 emails a day. We all get slightly less, but we're still well over 100 emails. We've received, since Zali started, 79,419 emails in our CRM program. That's our sort of customer relationship management program. We've sent out 53 or just over 53,000 emails. We've created and managed 42,781 cases. We do what we can to help you and advocate and escalate for you. Sometimes it does take us a day or 2 or a week to get back to you, but we try and get back to every single person that writes in. Please contact us if you need any assistance. We're here to help. However, I know you're not here to listen to me, and I know you've come out on a Monday night, so I would like to welcome Zali to the stage. And while she comes to the stage, just a little bit of housekeeping. We are recording tonight, so you can watch it back and you can send it on to friends. Please put your phones on silent or even switch them off. I know that's terrifying, but we should only be sort of an hour and a half. Anyone needs to go to the bathroom, there are toilets just out the back and to the right. Zali.
Hi everyone, thank you Nicola. She is just a force to be reckoned with for me in the office, keeping everyone happy. You know what they say, the best way of managing a team is to get the right people in the right seats and surround yourself with the people with the skills that you know are going to help run the show and really deliver. And Nicola and the team in the EO are just amazing, and we haven't actually had much turnover of staff, which hopefully is a good sign. sign that it's all working really well. I'd like to start by also paying my respects to traditional elders of the land on which we meet, noting that our area had such a strong support for the voice for the referendum only a little while ago. And I would like to say, I guess, thank you, but also highlighting the importance of that, because for many First Nations leaders, they took a lot of solace out of knowing that our areas, in particular the Sydney area, if you look at, from Mackellar to Warringah, North Sydney, Wentworth and the city areas were strongly in support. And that showed that understanding that for Australia to genuinely be the best Australia that it can be and really live up to its full potential, it does need to reconcile with its past. And that recognition was a step of part of that journey of reconciliation. So whilst it was a very difficult outcome for the referendum for First Nations leaders, they are incredibly thankful to our communities. And in fact, I've been endeavouring to work with them as much as possible to ensure we continue to find the opportunities to give them better voice and better recognition in legislation. And I'll come to that in a little bit. Also, there's been boundary changes. So Warringah has changed, we've grown. We've unfortunately lost some communities to the north to Mackellar, but the seat of North Sydney has been abolished. And that was incredibly sad, I think, North Sydney having been a federation seat for a long time, having its really distinct personality. And I think for the communities there, really, really difficult. But as a result, we do have to accept the result, and the outcome is that now part of Warringah, we've been calling it New Warringah, but we have Camaray, Cremorne and Crow's Nest, Kirribilli, Lavender Bay, Neutral Bay, North Sydney, Milson's Point, McMahon's Point, all the way to Waverton and Wollstonecraft joining Warringah. So it's really quite broad if you think about Warringah as an electorate. Now goes all the way from Freshwater, still has a little bit of the Lambie Heights area, all the way to Wollstonecraft and Waverton. Of course, we're excited to welcome those new areas into the community. In many ways, it's pulling together communities that were sort of maybe arbitrarily divided across electorates. I know some that live in the Cremorne areas and some of the Neutral Bay areas have at times been in Warringah and out of Warringah, and maybe this will offer some simplicity. But I am excited to welcome such a vibrant, multicultural community. Families, young professionals, slightly different demographic to the rest of Warringah, but still a lot of similarity. Health workers, business leaders, entrepreneurs, and to me that is all that extra talent and expertise that will help, and they're huge strength to our community ultimately. I would like to take the opportunity to thank Kylie Tink for her work on behalf of the North Sydney electorate and many in her team. She'll really appreciate that. She's got a fifth bout of COVID at the moment and she's doing it tough. But she's worked incredibly hard, and in fact we did a bit of a nod to many of the volunteers of her team that have joined our team now with a bit of a pink heart as part of our logo. But obviously the seat of North Sydney has been divvied up into three, a part 36,000 into Warringah, a part into Bennelong and a part into Bradfield. And so obviously that brings a lot of different issues to the fore, and different challenges depending on the areas of Warringah when it comes to feedback around transport in particular, access to certain services. It's quite different depending on where you live in the electorate. It's now very much a 50-50. Ironically, the infamous Spit Bridge is the link between about 50% of our community is north of Spit Bridge and 50% south of Spit Bridge over to the lower North Shore. But for me, this obviously today it's a really important opportunity for me to give you an update about what we've been working on, what I'm sort of committing to for this next election, but also to hear from you and the concerns. And in registering, many of you lodged questions, and so they are very much around transport, nuclear, climate risk, the Israel-Palestine conflict, and I'll take the opportunity to address those, and then we'll take some more questions from the floor. So, as Nicola said, there's a huge volume of work, and a lot of people don't always, understand or haven't really related to federal members of Parliament and the work we do. A huge part is that service of the community. That's the number one part of the job. And that's from NDIS and hosting forums, surveys, grants, and small business. So often the question is always, well, what have you delivered for the electorate? Well, I'm glad to say we've delivered more funding. Grants have increased to some 300 million, and we've had in particular grants for specific things like Manly Surf Club, the Manly Warringah Gymnastics Centre of Excellence, 2 million for Middlehead Oval upgrades, which are very relevant for our community here. And we've had a commitment to a community battery down at the swimming pool down in Manly at the Aquatic Centre. So a number of grants. It's also made up of grants where I'm supporting private business and charities to be able to apply and engage with the system and look for all those opportunities. So I really view it as, how can I be a spokesperson on behalf of our community, our organisations and our local businesses to really engage and seek out those opportunities for funding. It's writing letters of support, it's knocking on the doors of ministers and hassling until we get outcomes in relation to support locally. To give you an example, there has been organisations called Street Work and Youth Up Front that have been desperately needing funding since change of government and change of grants structures. I happened to be in the car hearing of a grant being announced, but the government had kept it quiet. We were able to quickly drum up support, get her a letter of support, get an application in, and that has been one of the successful grant applications from the electorate. So it is always about being on our toes and looking for those opportunities on behalf of the community. As Nicola said, we've resolved around 42,000 cases. Now, what does that mean? That's people writing to us needing help with a visa, during COVID needing help with exemptions and opportunities to travel. It might be, it went from getting a passport in the days when it was incredibly hard to get to passports, but it also might be an NDIS plan that's been changed unilaterally and needing to engage with the system to have it review or to accelerate a review because people are distressed. It can also be aged care plans that are taking too long and there's a delay and there's an urgent need for that to be delivered. And so that's where that proactive aspect for me and the team is incredibly important, to resolve the issues, to call the federal department, to advocate on behalf of the community. And that's where that link between local and what we and federal really matters. Of, you know, the politics and the policies have to be translated back down to the local community. And so we've hosted a number of forums to make sure the community has that opportunity to engage. There's been about 40 community forums since in the last 6 years, so quite a lot. Some have been online, some in person, from aged care, small business, transport and housing. In particular, when we've had the review of NDIS, I felt it was very important that the community and those that are either, need the scheme, but also those that work with the scheme, have that opportunity to be heard. So Bill Shorten, Minister at the time for Government Services, came for the forum, answered questions, and then we had a follow-up once a review and the recommendations were issued and the new legislation, to have the feedback after and then alleviating concerns and getting that interaction. We had that second one online with the Minister again. So to me, that is the good aspect of serving the community and the representation. Making sure I'm taking Warringah to Canberra, but also making sure we're pulling back the curtain on Canberra to ensure you have that opportunity to participate. The second big aspect of the job is the policy piece, and that's where, at least as a lawyer, I can totally engage with that aspect of looking at the laws that are presented, making sure we make them robust and improve them where we can. And that's probably an area that I've been the most disillusioned with. As a lawyer, as a barrister, you argue over the minutiae of every section, right? A judge might, looking at interpretations of individual words, and the outcome of a case can depend on that. And so you assume that in Canberra great care is taken to make sure the legislation is robust and specific and precise. And it was often a little disappointing for me to see that sometimes legislation is not the best that it could be once it's passed in Parliament, that often it's passed in she'll be right kind of way, that it's not engaged with robustly enough. Process like the consideration in detail process, where you should be able to engage with the Minister who has carriage of the legislation to ask them specific questions about a provision so that they are on the record. And what's useful about that is if you have a court case down the road, those comments on the record matter because they can help direct a judge in what was intended by the provision, what was intended by that section. So to me, all that detailed work really matters. And obviously being able to improve legislation. So to give you an idea of how it's worked in this term of Parliament, because I know there's always a lot of concern and a lot of hype by media about, a big crossbench will be chaotic and it's going to be all too complicated. In reality, it's been very, very constructive this term of Parliament. The way we've engaged with the government is that we have a regular, we call it Tuesday night speed dating, where basically for an hour the government, the minister with carriage of a matter, from the Treasurer to Penny Wong to all, doesn't matter the seniority, have come to present the bill that they're intending to table, the reasoning why they are doing the bill, and then engage with concerns we might have, and we can do follow-up meetings and discuss proposed amendments at a later date. And these briefings are open to the crossbench house, so the crossbench in the House, so the lower house, but also in the Senate. So from David Pocock, Jackie Lambie, Pauline Hanson doesn't turn up quite as often, but and then to the lower house, and we can really engage with that. And that's a really important process of scrutinising, and it was quite interesting how some quite senior ministers were at times quite nervous at the prospect of having to come and present and explain the legislation they intended to table. And it often opened up areas of where it could be improved. And a classic area around that was actually very recently through the scams legislation, where we had been discussing with stakeholder groups around, and especially consumer advocate groups, concerned about the level of scams in Australia. It's something like $27 billion is lost to scams by Australians, and a lot of it is due to the electronic interactions that are so prevalent in our lives. So very long overdue that we have that kind of a more robust legislation to protect us, consumers. And it was really clear very quickly from the briefing from the minister that the legislation was too much of a David and Goliath battle, that consumers were going to have to prove and establish that a scam had been conducted, and that how could they prove that the platforms or the banks had not taken due care to protect them from scams to then be entitled to redress or arbitration to try and resolve the scheme and ultimately get compensation. So there was a perfect case scenario of getting a lot of amendments, which couldn't quite get the minister and the government to agree to a full reversal the way the UK has in their legislation. But I proposed, and the government accepted and ultimately passed those amendments, that at the very least there should be a reversal of onus when it comes to being able to, that a victim, a consumer doesn't have to prove that the platforms and the banks have met their responsibilities. It is their duty to prove that they have, and then that is all admissible evidence. So again, taking a little bit of pressure off the consumer from having that David and Goliath battle. So there's some of the ways that we do improve legislation, and this matters because if you have been victim of a scam, having a system that is going to be consumer friendly is important. We were also able to get a review period into the legislation to make sure that in 2 years, if it's not meeting the needs and the expectations of the community, the government of the day has a duty to review the legislation and improve it. And that's a commitment that I'm very focused on. So all up, I've had between 18 and 20 amendments passed in relation to legislation. I have moved a lot more than that. I've moved about 380, I think, amendments. And often, so some are overtly accepted by government. Others become part of the government's thinking and are endorsed by them, and they end up adopting them as part of their suite of amendments. And then other times, the amendments that the government has moved some way in wanting them, but hasn't quite gotten over the line for various reasons that they will give. And myself and my colleagues on the crossbench will work with the crossbench in the Senate with those amendments to sort of convey where we got to in negotiations so that they can take on the baton and get there as well. And so often amendments that have ultimately been subject of negotiation and passed in the Senate actually originated in the House with the crossbench in the House to really start, I sort of compare it to tilling the ground where we're getting social licence for those changes. And some areas, for example, have been raising objection to the taxing of unrealised capital capital gains in relation to superannuations over $3 million, which is great concern to small businesses and also landowners, especially farms, for example, where taxing of unrealised capital gains is problematic. So we've fought hard, put a lot of amendments up against that, objecting to it in the lower house, and that passed on into the Senate, and ultimately that legislation has not passed because with concerted efforts we've been able to stop that. Other areas I've put amendments has been around the Fair Works legislation amendment, where I passed amendments to clarify that a small business means a business that employs less than 50 employees. The government wanted that limit to be much smaller, and so targets much smaller businesses, which becomes really onerous for small business in maintaining and being able to get to that compliance piece. Climate change bill, one of the very first pieces of legislation the government passed in this term, and obviously something that I'd been fighting for since 2019, that we should legislate our commitment to net zero by 2050 to future-proof it to the extent that it's passed in law, that there's a process, a science-based process of updating our commitments to the Paris Agreement, but also ensuring that we can't scale it back without, I guess, a majority in both houses agreeing to amend legislation. So legislating our commitment is very important to secure it, to make it very hard to wind back. But in that process, negotiated with the Minister, Chris Bowen, passed amendments to improve the accountability of the government, to make emissions reduction targets based off independent advice by the Climate Change Authority. So again, trying to bring, I know it sometimes sounds really logical, but to make sure that the government of the day has to get publicly recommendations from the Climate Change Authority, and then if the government was to depart, they have to explain that, because another amendment passed by the crossbench was that the government of the day has to respond publicly in Parliament to the recommendations and the yearly climate statement, so that we get a little more visibility and accountability. Really important. Another area, Future Made in Australia bill, I passed amendments that guarantee that First Nations communities and traditional owners can participate in and share in the benefit of the net zero transition. So again, an important way of giving effect to the community's support for First Nations community by trying to embed that into that commitment into legislation. Now, some of the other things we've done, because I know the question is always raised, what have we done? We've put a lot of pressure and achieved results when it comes to HECS indexation. Now, anyone who's gone back to university or have young people in their family, young adults who have studied, the generational inequity at the moment is really stark. The HECS debt that young people accumulate is really problematic, especially also single women who often go back and retrain, and then that debt becomes a real barrier to opportunity and housing and other aspects. So being able to make HECS more affordable was incredible. It took a lot of pressure on the government. I know the government will like to say that they were going to do it anyway, but it was a pretty big petition and a lot of publicity and a lot of push from the crossbench that got it over the line. We also pushed them to strengthen paid parental leave. It was Labor that had brought it down to an age cut-off of 8, and we pushed them to push it back up to 14. And that was, I do think, because of having a large crossbench in Parliament, but also I think a lot of women in Parliament, having an increased gender equity has meant that issues are on the table that may not have had the focus they could have had in the past. And increasing the rates of job seeker and youth allowance, I think these are really important as people are feeling the pressure of cost of living. It's really important that we have a system, a safety net that helps the most vulnerable in our community. And thirdly, the other part of the job is running the small team, right, with not that much resources, but it is like a small business. So I do understand the challenges small businesses face, because it's very much what running an independent office is like. And with that team of about 11 and 1,500 volunteers, you can imagine it's very important to have efficiencies and process. And some of the things we've done to help the community has, for example, been the Seniors Guide. Now, some of you may have had access to it. We've got copies here if anyone hasn't seen it. And that was simply through experience. One of my volunteers and incredible, in the team, Jeanette, pulled together the experience of dealing with local government, state and federal processes and systems, and pulled together just a really simple hard copy version and an electronic if you need of how to navigate the system, to understand the differences and the thresholds. And so I think that is an essential part of serving the community, is actually having those practical aspects. And I encourage anyone who hasn't seen it to check it out. And we've had over 600 constituents call for that, and that's something just generated by our office, and we've now shared it with many other offices who then can adapt it to their communities. So there's some of the things, I guess, to give you an idea of over the last 6 years. We haven't been twiddling our thumbs. We have been working pretty hard, and for me it's been fascinating. I've got to say, being a politician was not automatically on my bingo card of careers. I'm sort of an accidental politician maybe, but it is incredibly rewarding to be at the right place at the right time to generally help people, and I am incredibly thankful of the community and my team who go above and beyond to help people when they need it. But so the future, while for me the last 6 years have been incredible, there's no doubt we need many more smart solutions for the problems where we are. We're in 2025, we're halfway through a really vital decade when it comes to transition and climate risk. And to me, a key aspect of what government must deliver is keeping our communities safe. If our community is not safe at home, online or at work, we have a fundamental problem. Government is not delivering. So for me, that means making sure we do have funding for early childhood and family services, and we've been able to deliver that locally with some additional funding. It does mean addressing domestic violence. If we have to be able to be safe at home, homes is one of the places where women are most at risk. That is just unacceptable in modern day Australia. Now, the government have often called it a crisis, called a national cabinet, but hasn't matched that with the kind of funding that helps and actually address it on a crisis footing. What we do need is more funding for frontline services like Mary's House at North Sydney, and we've got a number of them on the other side of the electorate. It does mean we need legal aid, legal services. If you can't access legal aid or legal advice, it's very difficult to navigate the system and turn up unrepresented in court and deal with that. We've called for the increase of the Staying Home Leaving Violence program to enable more victims to stay in the home rather than it always being perpetrators staying in the home and victims having to leave, because we simply will never have enough crisis accommodation. We need that online safety, and that's where my colleague Zoe Daniel has introduced a duty of care bill, which I strongly support. Now, the government introduced the restriction on people under 16 accessing social media. Unfortunately, there is very little belief that it's going to be able to be applied in a meaningful way and that we'll be able to actually prevent people from actually getting online. What we really need is a duty of care, so that there's a responsibility to keep people safe online. If not, those platforms will be on the hook for the damages that they cause if they fail to put in place the necessary protections. I think that's really important. Of course, that all came about when we were also pushing for a ban on gambling advertising. Now, I love sport, obviously with my background, but sport has become this gamified gambling addiction, and it is ruining sport and it's ruining so many people in our community. The amount of money lost to gambling is horrific in Australia, and in particular young men. Young men are incredibly targeted by gamified advertising that make them think it's part of enjoying the sport, and they are hooked. It drives and links into endorphins, and it's incredibly damaging. We know gambling can lead to increased rates of domestic violence, substance abuse, mental health, suicide, financial distress. It costs our community a huge amount by then having to roll out so many other services. So look, I'm a bit cynical that the government has been reluctant and so far avoided the calls to ban gambling advertising to ensure we're not creating that constant reminder through television, online, on your phone. But that is absolutely a commitment for me to keep pushing for that. We have to be able to be safe online, watching sport, and then at work, obviously with the implementation of Respect at Work and all the very important sort of changes to discrimination legislation. So again, also safety is being able to have a home and housing, and we know that problem has really been exacerbated recently. It's not an overnight problem. This is a problem that's been 40 years of policy in the making, but in the last few years it has really tipped over. Warringah has less than 1% rental availability, so very little available, and very high rents, where we have a high level of rental stress. In terms of ownership of homes, we have this part of the electorate has about 60% homeowners, 40% renters. North Sydney area is more of a 50-50. Great concern when we talk about cost of living is around insurance premiums and how they are rising to matters where we're now aware from recent polling that about 1 in 5 people are either uninsured or underinsured. So that's really concerning what that means for people's main asset. So there's a lot I want to tackle when it comes to safety. Of course, there's health and other issues, but that's a key priority. I then think we have to make sure government supports our communities and people, and that means to be able to be the best that we can be, but also to embrace opportunities and what's available. And that's where I do think of our small businesses, because my observation of Parliament and Canberra is big business has the ear of government, right? Big business has plenty of lobbying, they get in there pretty easily. Small business is much harder and gets a lot of lip service from the major parties, not much action. There's been a lot of political to and froing around the instant asset write-off for small businesses, and so I've pushed on a number of times amendments around increasing that to 50,000 and making that permanent, so the businesses can count on it. It doesn't become this political football that gets changed around from year to year, and businesses aren't able to plan for it. And very committed to reducing the red tape burden on small business. There's been a number of changes in this term of Parliament around IR regulations and requirements on small businesses, and I've had many a fight with the Minister and with Tony Burke around the definitions of small business, what the number of employees, where do we set the line and the cap, and we've constantly been pushing him to raise it so that you're not targeting small businesses that simply cannot afford the compliance and the red tape and the regulatory burden that the legislation changes bring on. So keep advocating for that. Of course, supporting our community has to mean modern transport. Now, that is a state responsibility, but we have to work together. All levels have to work. And so there is, I have got a commitment and an ask around Infrastructure Australia, funding with state government, upgrading a couple of interchanges to ensure that we do better around transport congestion. Military Road is one of the most congested roads in Sydney and in the state. Now, the Perrottet government shelved the Beaches Link tunnel, and then the Minns government shelved it again. So, unfortunately, both major parties looked to our communities and felt that the cost of that project was not warranted from a vote or a political priority, and they shelved it. So my concern has been then what is plan B? If they are not in government, either side are not going to progress it, then what is plan B? Because the community is really reliant on very limited public transport. We don't have, well, ironically with the new Warringah, we now have a metro and railway in the North Sydney area, but for the peninsula, it's very limited. We have boats and ferries or buses. Buses have been incredibly challenging. Unfortunately, privatised by the previous state coalition government, and then there hasn't been enough maintenance and a keeping up of the amount of buses that we needed. There's been a lot of pressure by a number of MPs, in particular Michael Regan, the independent member for Wakehurst, and I've met with the COO of Kelly Downer, and we've been pressuring both the state government and there has now, obviously you may have seen in the news, that commitment to buying more buses, having more buses come out of servicing. But there is still a federal issue, which is actually getting bus drivers. So anyone out there that feels like a second career of becoming a bus driver, please consider it. They are desperately needing bus drivers. And it's about thinking about it as being from the community, serving the community. It is a service. They have a huge shortage, and unless they can get drivers, the buses are very hard to run. So I will be advocating on their behalf with the Minister. There is an ask for example, establishing a visa pathway for permanent residency to attract people to come and be bus drivers. If we cannot source them here in our community, then we need to get bus drivers in, because if you don't have public transport, everything comes to a standstill. And of course, an effective NDIS with changes and aged care plans, which big changes happening this term to aged care with a redistribution of them, going from 4 plans to 8 and different provisions. So it'll be very important to make sure the community understands how to use that. Finally and ultimately, I think we want to be a strong Australia. There's a lot of anxiety. There's a lot going on around the world at the moment, and obviously a fairly uncertain US. And so ultimately, I believe strength for a nation is not just a matter of arms or defence, it's actually about process. So our democracy is only as strong as its integrity and accountability. Again, that's something we delivered with the National Anti-Corruption Commission, but that needs amending. I want to make sure it has a lower threshold for finding of corrupt conduct, and it needs to have public hearings. We need to see that there is investigation occurring. I don't think the current model is meeting the public expectation. I also think that we need integrity in politics, which, as many would be aware, I've been pushing that we have truth in political advertising. Many may have heard me say, 2019, when I became a politician, I was astounded to know that we protect our consumer rights with consumer law to ensure that we are not scammed when we're buying a service or a good, to ensure that advertising is not misleading or deceptive. But yet when we come to what I think is our most valuable right, our voting right, we have no protections against being scammed. And that's why I think truth in political advertising is very important. It's not a question of breaching freedom of speech. The High Court has said very clearly, freedom of speech is not freedom to lie. And so truth in political advertising does not breach that. Look, we did have agreement. The government had indicated a willingness to do that. I've put 2 versions of bills up to assist, and there was support in the crossbench in both houses for legislation to go through. Unfortunately, probably not surprisingly, the major parties have done a deal in relation to electoral reform, whereby 2 bills got tabled in Parliament in November last year, one for donation reform, one for electoral communication reform. And part of the deal was, if they agreed on an arrangement in relation to the electoral donation reform that essentially locks in the advantage of major parties, gives a great amount of public funds to major parties and incumbents, there was an agreement to shelve the Electoral Communication Act because the coalition didn't like that one. So I was fairly angry about it, but I kept my calm as I confronted Don Farrell. But I think this is not finished business, and my commitment will be to keep fighting for these changes. It's really important that this integrity piece is addressed. Now, voters of all persuasion, whether they vote Labor, Green or Coalition or even One Nation voters, support truth in political advertising. So that's why it's really, it's really always a surprise that is still such a sticking point. Ultimately, I think it's because traditional politics want to keep the loophole, right? They want to be able to run the advertising that suits them rather than be honest about it. So in the alternative, I have put up a voluntary ethical political advertising code, and I've got, I hope, copies of it down here if anyone wants to check it out. And that is very similar to what happens in consumer advertising, where there is voluntary codes of standards that you commit to apply when you put your advertising. I will have it, and you'll see a logo on a lot of my material. It's also around addressing AI and deepfakes. We have no protections around deepfakes and AI in advertising. I find that just staggering. The technology is progressing so fast, and our laws and regulations are not keeping up. And I think we really need guardrails to make sure we are protected and keep things safe. Another big piece for me is addressing climate risk. So when I was elected in 2019, I committed to be a climate champion, a champion for action, to push the government around net zero by 2050, but also around regular assessments and ambition when it comes to our nationally determined contribution under the Paris Agreement. Now, the next one was actually due back in February, but there is one due any day, the 2035 target. With Trump withdrawing the US from the Paris Agreement, it's more important than ever for us to take on that leadership. It's a false premise to think that because the US has vacated that field, that somehow the problem goes away. The physics haven't changed, right? You can change the language, you can change who's calling it out, but the physics haven't changed. And unfortunately, we're seeing with warming oceans, with warming temperatures, we are seeing those changes accelerating and getting more and more severe. LA fires are described just in ways that are just hard to envisage. The amount of flooding we get on such a regular basis, whilst something like a cyclone will be less frequent, when they come, they will be more severe because of the amount of humidity in the air from the warmer oceans. All these things are being exacerbated. And so, whilst on one hand, I will push the government for a minimum 75% commitment by 2035 as our next nationally determined contribution, I'm also pushing for a safety plan. We need to legislate climate risk assessments and adaptation planning. So I've got a private members bill that I've got an exposure draft that I am seeking support from the government on, and the opposition and private business. I've had round tables with insurance, with banking, with everyone. It's vital that we address this. Your insurance premiums, if we talk cost of living, your insurance premiums have risen by 32% on average since 2022, and that is only going in one direction. Yes, there are a lot of elements that involved in the pricing, and there are taxes and other areas, but the overwhelming issue is that on a yearly basis, insurance companies price risk. And if risk is increasing and events happen more and more frequently, they have to assess how much they can cover and what the fiscal model can be. And ultimately, who pays? It's us, it's communities, because you end up paying to protect your largest asset through insurance, or having to take this roulette of not having insurance to the full value of your possessions, or having no insurance at all. And it's a false premise to think that if you live on top of a hill, that your house won't be at risk. The way insurance companies price it is they look at a postcode, right? So it's averaged out over the whole community. So you may not physically be at risk, but you will still be paying for the average risk of the whole area. So it is important that we address this. So the private members bill ensures the government of the day must do every 5 years we have a national risk assessment that identifies physical risks, so coastal erosion, flooding risk, bushfires, droughts, transition risk, workforces, areas where they are going to lose jobs because we move away from certain industries and we have to transition. Everything should be taken into account and at arm's length from government. So you don't cherry pick what piece you want to acknowledge to the public and what piece you'd prefer to keep hidden. And that's why it's so important. And then the bill provides for adaptation planning. The government of the day must put forward an adaptation plan, and then the Climate Authority does yearly reporting as to the implementation. I think that is vital to keep our communities safe. We're already in 2025. We have essentially passed 1.5 degrees. Every little bit of action we take now to keep ourselves as far under 2 degrees is vital. The reality is we're not on track for that. We're on track for more like 2.5 to 3 degrees, and areas of Australia might even hit the 3.5 up north. And that has really serious consequences to the safety. It means some communities need to implement heat rooms, right? Cool rooms to deal with heat. Heat stress kills most people in Australia. We need to be able to, we have building codes that are adapted to changing conditions depending on where communities are. We need to stop building in floodplains. I think that goes without saying. The cheapest house is the house you only build once. It's not the one you have to build again and again because events undo it. So these are all the things that need to be built in. And I'm always shocked by the statistic, but for every $1 we invest now in prevention, we save $11 down the road when it comes to the cost of disasters. Now, to give you an idea, you would have seen it in the media, our ex-cyclone Alfred alone was costing something like $1.2 billion a day. And in the budget that I'll go down to hear next week from the Treasurer, he's expecting an even greater blowout than what was anticipated. We have to stop just spending after a disaster has happened and dealing with a disaster. We have to start investing in resilience and planning ahead. And ultimately that pays off for the public, because that means you're addressing risk, and then we can start to address ever-rising insurance premiums. So there's some of the ways that I have a long list, as you can imagine, but for now, that is my key commitment in terms of, I guess, seeking re-election for Warringah in the issues that I'm sort of committing to champion in Parliament around those key areas. If I could go to some of the questions, and did you want to put the questions to me, or how do you want to do it?
So we had about 30 questions that were submitted online, starting with registration. And what we've done is we've distilled them down to about 5, but there will be some time at the end if anyone does want to ask any questions. The first question was actually on transport, but I actually feel like you've answered that. Unless there was anything more you wanted to say, we could stick to the next question.
Well, I think maybe obviously it's working with state government, because a lot of it is state, but for big infrastructure pieces it requires funding through Infrastructure Australia, so it has to be advocating for that. But we do need clear plans for how that can happen. Electrifying transport's meant a lot, so I called for and advocated for the fuel efficiency standards, which have now been implemented. They can still be tightened, there are loopholes in them, but they have seen in our area, in Warringah, 173% increase in sale of electric vehicles. So that's great, right? That is good, because the beauty about EVs, especially electric buses, which are scheduled to be rolled out in our area, is they are so much quieter and cleaner. And so whilst it doesn't get rid of the congestion, it will get rid of the noise pollution to an extent. And so it really is a positive thing.
Thank you. The next one. There were a couple of questions on the Israel and Gaza conflict. What is your position on this?
Yes. It's been an incredibly hard time, very distressing for many in our community. From the events of October 7 that were shocking and really confronting for many in our community, especially Jewish Australians in our community. And I've had engagement with the the Qumran Synagogue, Rabbi Chaim, and others leaders in the community. And it's been really important to make sure that they do feel supported, because obviously there also has been a rise of anti-Semitism, and that is incredibly distressing and confronting. And we can't have a situation where we import a foreign conflict to make people feel unsafe in our community. On the other hand, we've also had very distressing events happening in Gaza, with obviously a war conflict having a huge humanitarian cost. And that's where it again has been incredibly polarising. I guess I am pragmatic as to the extent to which what can be influenced. I've had a number of briefings with Minister Wong around that, and especially around that question of Australia is a respected voice, but not a pivotal voice. And so in terms of how we can influence or change the course of that conflict. I've called for ensuring that humanitarian aid be there and that there be humanitarian visas for those escaping war zones. I've called out when there's been attempts to block that from happening, which would have been the very first war conflict to which we didn't offer assistance to families seeking refuge. I was able, incredibly, to help some particular families that I had actually met in 2020 before, but down in Northstone Surf Club, a family who actually, they had been implementing a Gaza NIPPERS program, where helping water safety, you know, no different to our families wanting kids to have water safety. Sadly, many were killed from that program once the conflict escalated, and a family were seeking refuge, were able to get out, but obviously needed help with getting visas and accreditation from the minister. I was notified, I think it was like Christmas Eve or the day before, and we were on the phone advocating, ensuring that assistance could be rolled out and supported. And in fact, I had the incredible, the privilege to meet that family once they made it to Australia and safe, and then I've been able to advocate on their behalf with the minister to ensure that they're supported and that they are able to enter the community. I've supported other programs that are seeking to assist as well. But it has been very difficult. It's been the one A conflict has been one of the key pieces of correspondence our office has received. Very distressing content frequently gets sent to my team from people advocating on the extremes of both sides. And I have tried to keep a sensible approach, and an approach that puts our community first and the social cohesion of our community at first. So if you look at my voting record, for example, I have supported the motions by the government that have been carefully worded to ensure they strike the right balance. I have not supported amendments or motions put forward by the Greens, which I think are seeking to polarise and politicise and capitalise on community distress. And I also have not supported motions put forward by the Coalition, who I think are also trying to polarise and capitalise on community distress. But I appreciate that not everyone will be happy with the position I've taken, but for me the priority has been Warringah and not importing the foreign conflict here.
Thank you. And I know it's sort of hard to move from that question to this one. Do you think our tax system is fit for purpose?
We're really moving along. Tax reform is difficult. It's obviously it's politically fraught, and I would say the major parties don't want to touch it. They might tinker a little bit. There has been, of course, the stage 3 tax cuts, but then there's been, I think, the overreach when it comes to the superannuation and the taxing of unrealised capital gains. But working with other members of the crossbench, in particular Allegra, with experts to see where do we need to go, what changes need to happen to the tax system. There's no magic wand, but we do have to be aware of the limitations and the problems. Our system at the moment relies on 4 people work for every 2 people that don't work. By 2040, that reverses. We will have 2 people working for 4 people not working. And so we need to address that. It's just not sustainable, and all those 4 people not working will be wanting healthcare and aged care and NDIS and supports, and so it just is not going to work. We have to have those tough conversations. There's no clear solutions, but I think the crossbench is really able to push the major parties into engaging with what needs to happen, and so to make sure that we do have a tax system fit for purpose.
Thank you. The other one that came up a bit as well was around nuclear. So what is your view of the nuclear energy solution being proposed by the Coalition?
Okay, a lot of discussion on this issue as well. In 2019, when I first got into Parliament, I have been since, the crossbench representative on the Joint Standing Committee into Climate, Energy, Environment and Water. And in 2019, the Morrison government asked the committee to conduct a review and an inquiry into should we lift the moratorium that bans nuclear energy in Australia. And that inquiry was chaired by Ted O'Brien, who is the shadow energy representative for the Coalition. So very aware of the limitations. And I'd encourage anyone who is wondering is to go and actually look at those reports from that inquiry, because ironically back then Ted understood that it is incredibly challenging in Australia and would be very slow and costly and difficult to implement, and in fact large-scale nuclear would be completely out of the question. You could only contemplate small modular reactors, and even that was very far off into the future and would take a lot of work with community. Now, fast track a few years and we seem to have a very different position from Ted O'Brien in relation to nuclear. My position is pragmatic, and I look to what are our natural advantage. Australia as a continent has natural advantage when it comes to renewable energy. We have space, we have a lot of sunshine and a lot of wind, and we are an island, which means we have a lot of coast. So offshore wind can play a huge part when it comes to supporting industry, because often winds offshore are at different times to winds onshore, and it doesn't require the same amount of transmission lines. Now, people will bring up a lot of objections when it comes to offshore wind, but I would point out the visual pollution concerns are unfounded, as are the marine life impacts and environmental impacts. Because in reality, line of sight of an average person looking out to the horizon is 4.8 kilometres. All of these wind zones are at least 10 kilometres out. So you are not, this idea that you're going to have these looming structures on your horizon are just misinformation. But the reality around nuclear is it is too costly and it will take too long. We are in a vital decade. Much of Australia's coal-fired power stations are due to retire by 2035. And if you can imagine your really old Holden car, right, 40 years old, that is just clonking out and you're never too sure if it's going to make the journey, and you go frequently to the garage to get it tinkered up and fixed up, reality is that's what coal-fired power stations are like. And they cost a lot of money to keep running. They frequently break down or are out of service, and that is incurring a lot of cost to the system. So the only way we can address that is to implement rapid deployment of energy supply. And nuclear does not fit that purpose. It is not flexible and it cannot be deployed fast. The estimates provided by the coalition are just do not stack up to scrutiny if you look anywhere else in the world. So I'm pragmatic that nuclear might be the energy of choice or the right choice for other countries, for other continents where they don't have our advantage. But the reality for Australia, where we are on a timeline to reduce emissions and to replace energy at the most cost-efficient way, it simply does not deliver for Australia. Their plan relies on keeping coal in the system for longer, but also gas. Gas is expensive, and just approving more gas extraction does not make it cheaper because invariably it gets sold to export. 70% of Australia's gas goes to export, and then we buy it back at really high prices. It is not the solution when we have much more reliable energy and cost-effective energy. Ultimately, and I'm pushing for this in the budget next week, I'm calling on the government to increase supports to help families, households, small businesses to electrify, to get rooftop solar, batteries, turn to EVs, get off gas, get off expensive energy from the grid. The way you can reduce your power bills is to buy less from the grid and make more from your home. It's really a simple equation. Of course, there are challenges for stratas and people that are renters, and that is where there's a number of experts coming together with solutions, and that might well involve some incentives for landlords. And ironically, when I've met with the minister about this, they take a little bit of a line of, well, we don't want to give landlords any more perks. And it's very kind of counterproductive because the reality is unless we come together to solve these problems, renters and tenants will pay the price of landlords not stepping up to getting renewable energy and rooftop solar. So things like energy efficiency ratings for rental properties and having incentives to electrify, these are all things on the table that we're looking at. But yes, no, nuclear is there's nothing wrong with nuclear in other nations, but it's a big, it impacts insurance, the regulatory framework is huge. It's simply not a viable option for Australia.
Okay, thank you. Now, keeping in mind it's nearly 7:30 and we do want to leave probably before midnight. This is the last question before we throw to the audience. How is the current US government affecting Australia? And how should Australia respond to changes in US politics? I know this is going to be hard.
That's a big one. 30 seconds or less. Well, look, instability and unpredictability has to be the way we look at that. And we did, with other members of the crossbench, get a briefing when we were last in Parliament from various agencies around how they anticipated engaging with the US, the Trump 2.0 administration would go, what would be needed, how do we work. A lot of it was unknown. Obviously, the threat of tariffs was still just a threat. Now it has materialised. It's going to be really important to find the right line. I was quite shocked about the position with Ukraine, very concerned about that. I've met with the Ukrainian ambassador and I strongly support that we maintain our support for a democratic nation under attack by an invader. I think it's going to be important to have nuance in how we deal with America. It's not talking tough, but then when it doesn't add up, isn't going to work. I think it has to be really mature and careful engagement with the US. I think we do have to diversify our trading and our defence situation. AUKUS is on a lot of people's minds. I think we need to look to the EU, a free trade agreement with the EU again, which brings a few other considerations, and the UK. We will need to diversify. Around AUKUS, for example, there is a drop dead of a timeline issue of 2028, by which time we are 10 years out from when the Collins-class submarines are due to no longer be viable in 2038. So by 2028, which is the end of this term, right, we're going to an election in 2025, by 2028, there needs to be clear assurances from the US that submarines would be delivered. Now, that is still under a Trump government, so there's a lot of questions around that. And with or without Trump, the issue around the submarines is they don't have the manufacturing capacity to deliver them. They are behind on their own production. So real important questions to be across are there. But we have also other, I wasn't aware of it before, but we have a number of defence businesses and infrastructure in the electorate, especially around drone technology. And my discussions with the Ukrainian ambassador was around, for example, that they are world leaders in drone technology and construction. And so that is where bilateral agreement with Australia could be really beneficial to improve our capacity. We are a huge continent. We are not going to be able to patrol or man every aspect without the assistance of drones, for example. So it's really important that we build that capacity, but also make sure Australia is strong. So that does mean, if you think back to COVID, where we really highlighted our supply chain questions, that we don't have enough domestic manufacturing, that is where Future Made in Australia and manufacturing incentives for Australia become really, really important to make sure we do have a level of independence and a level of trading power to make sure we can look after Australia first. I know, just one last bit, sorry. At the end of last year, I was able to go on a parliamentary delegation to China. I'd never been to China before, so I was very keen to go to understand their progress when it comes to their transition, renewable energy and transport. It was the first time that an Australian delegation in 7 years had been allowed into the country, so for me that was at least telling that the government had managed to bridge and get much better trading, and get some of the trading sanctions lifted with our biggest trading partner. But that was, again, fascinating to see the electrification of their transport and their progress. But the tone was very much, we will deal with each other respectfully, we will agree where we can, disagree where we must, and we will always put Australia's best interest first. I think, ironically, we're going to need to repeat some of those lines in all of our dealings, including the US.
Fantastic, thank you very much. Thank you, Zali. I am trying to throw it out now to the floor, so please put your hands up if you have a question. I will start at the front.
First off, thanks for doing this work and reflects this really characters with around community shows things that are side which as you can something well certainly back to AUKUS, I think there's much another dimension which we haven't really talked about. Trump has repeatedly mentioned that he wants to annex Greenland, he wants to annex Canada, and he wants to annex Gaza. We are dealing with military alliance, but do you think it's wise, I mean, it's going to be said that it's like $360 billion in to maybe be allocated on things like house splitting, housing, all these things like that? Or is there time to leave AUKUS, or should we say?
Well, the reality is Australia has had an alliance with the US from a security point of view for a long time. What's clear with the US's engagement with Ukraine is they are proceeding under different terms or in different ways with their allies and cannot all be counted on in quite the same way as they have in the past. The reality is, though, for Australia, from an alliance point of view, it's not like you have a huge amount of choice from a defence point of view of our continent. And it would be reckless to ignore that we do have geopolitical risk in our region. And there are, I would argue, major, power muscling around the globe, from Trump America, Putin with Russia, and obviously with China. And so we do need to be strong defensively to make sure we do have capacity to protect Australia and defend trading routes and our position. So I don't think it's a question of putting in question alliance with the US, even though obviously under Trump he is dealing with it. Excuse me. But I am seeking a lot of briefings from experts around how understanding the timeline. Obviously Trump will not be there forever, but what does that mean for long-term procurement questions like AUKUS? But also what are the alternatives to sandbag, if I could say, Australia's defence capabilities, diversify them where we can, to ensure that we have Plan B if the US does not deliver. Now, I think a lot of people don't. AUKUS is a very complex arrangement. It was part, ironically, of the Inflation Reduction Act as well. Pillar 1 of AUKUS is around provision of submarines, but Pillar 2 is around sharing of technology, of being able to, with the UK, the US and Australia, share technology and systems so that we can also develop our own capability. And that was seen as a really vital piece of the agreement to deliver benefit to technologies and manufacturing and industry in Australia. There are questions around how much will Pillar 2 still stack up under Trump, and I have a lot of questions about that. And that's why I am very keen to encourage the government of the day, whoever is in government, to look to other options and look to, obviously, the EU and the UK are increasing their budgets, their defence spend. The other piece, which I will be doing some work on in Parliament next week, but not always thought of, is the reality is climate risk is not just a domestic problem for our local safety, it is a geopolitical risk. It is a national security risk. In our region, Pacific nations are very acutely aware of the risks they are in. And what happens if US aid, for example, has been wound back by the US, what that does do is it leaves a void within our neighbouring countries. Geopolitically, that creates instability. And that can mean, through soft diplomacy, through aid, through other ways, Australia has a choice to step up and take on a leadership role, or the void is met by other nations, powerful nations that we don't really want to see establishing strong bases too close to Australia. So it's not a straightforward answer, but defence is a complex issue. I am concerned about the cost of dramatically increasing capability when we also have so many other demands on the budget, with an ageing population. Health, prevention are huge areas on the budget as well. Thanks.
Hi, Zali. Adrian Riddell. I was just wondering if it's sort of a bit of a segue, I guess, talking about our budget not, having so many demands on it. And then I've been looking, just in reading the news, seeing a lot of call for these rare earth minerals that we have plenty of here. And knowing that the big fossil fuel companies and mining companies don't really pay much for the resources that they dig out of the ground and sell overseas from this country, I'm wondering whether we could be trying to set up some kind of sovereign wealth fund by doing a much better deal for our rare earth minerals or things like that than just flogging them off to Donald Trump or whoever, as part of some deal, and whether this sort of fund could be set up so we don't blow this opportunity to use that. I mean, have you thought about anything like that?
We have. So rare earth minerals are still very much developing, and so at the moment we ironically have already, through previous governments, sold off rights of significant mines to China, for example. US has rights. We already have lost sovereignty over a huge amount of local resources, which is, I think, fairly concerning. We need to ensure we are recouping proper revenue from resources. At the end of the day, the biggest boom there is at the moment is ultimately gas. Now, gas is a resource of all Australians. It is drawn from our continent, and we really collect very little revenue for that. The government had an opportunity through the PRRT amendments, the Petroleum Resource Rent Tax. We pushed for a much stronger and greater amount of revenue to be collected on behalf of Australians. The government, very disappointingly, took the recommended range from Treasury and took the lowest range possible and the least amount of revenue we could recoup from it. So I thought that was quite unacceptable, moved amendments and tried to oppose it, but ultimately both Labor and the Coalition agreed with a leave pass on minerals and fossil fuels. So again, they're things that need to be tackled. Setting up another sort of sovereign wealth fund is, I think, we've probably missed that opportunity, but there are mechanisms within laws that already exist to recoup better revenue. So, for example, hiking up the PRRT, tightening out the loopholes. There's going to be a lot of discussion around CBAM, so carbon border adjustment mechanisms, to ensure that anything we import into Australia is in fact, we're sort of assessing the carbon impact of those imports. And the EU, for example, our free trade agreement with the EU fell down because of our less than adequate dealing with emissions in Australia versus what the EU were doing to protect their. Obviously, the question around tariffs is really heightening. Tariffs ultimately penalise us, right, because it makes things more expensive at home. It has to be looking at opportunities to prioritise made in Australia in Australian markets and not make things more expensive for Australians. So yes, rare earths and a lot of Future Made in Australia and the National Reconstruction Fund have specific funding pathways to help develop those capacities, and then we need to make sure the government of the day truly values them and doesn't sign them away to other nations, because they are vital. Who's got that?
Hi Zali, my name's Zali. I just wanted to ask about Medicare and the PBS systems. So I've seen some things just recently about some calls from like the Trump administration that they want to change up some of the deals that we do to get like the pharmaceuticals from their companies and good deals through the PBS. So I'm very worried that that will be messed with. And then the other thing is with Medicare, like whenever there's this like rise in authoritarianism, or what I was even like UK, they're talking about austerity, they might be doing more cuts to the NHS. Like, will you be always advocating for our Medicare system to stay protected with like an Australian value?
Absolutely. I mean, it's part of that core safe and supported aspect for me. If we don't have a good healthcare system, we have a problem. I mean, locally we actually have an issue on the beaches with the Northern Beaches Hospital, which is a private-public model, which is very complicated, and we've been pushing for the state government to do there's an independent auditor's report due to come out because of concerns. Staff that are incredible staff that are doing so much work, but are really in a really difficult work environment. But from that, Medicare, for example, and the PBS, very concerned about the discussions and noises coming out of the US around medicine and increasing tariffs or fees in relation to that. Also, healthcare is just such an essential aspect of our community. I mean, it has already been 5 years since COVID, but, it was such a stark reminder of the importance of our healthcare. Everything stops without a healthy community and healthcare. And we were able to push, for example, the government to implement a national CDC, a Centre for Disease Control, that it be national, not piecemeal around the country, with each state doing something different. Yes, I strongly support. I think the good news that has been coming out has been greater focus on women's health. For too long, sorry gentlemen, but for too long, healthcare system has assumed we're all the same with the same needs. The reality is there are many issues that women face that need specific addressing. Even things like, crash test dummies in cars aren't adequately equipped, don't take into account a women's body versus a men's body. But medication trials of medicines were often not done from gender-based as well. But so there's been a strong push, and I've had many a discussion with Jed Carney, the Assistant Minister, around women's health issues, especially around perimenopause and menopause, access to contraception, and issues that really impact women and young women, and I've welcomed the recent announcements in relation to that. But we do have a bigger underlying problem, not just Medicare, which we now have seen an increased, the indexation had been frozen for a long time, which was seeing a lot of GPs stop any kind of bulk billing. We are still, as a region, don't have particular high rates of bulk billing, but we need to that needs to keep increasing. We have a shortage of GPs, and we have other issues. We also have some decisions the government has taken around restricting opportunities for nurse practitioners to access Medicare as well. So there is and bulk billing. So there's a number of issues that there are inconsistencies. Whilst there's been some progress, I think it's really important to stay vigilant on it. And I am committed to doing that. Who else has got a question? Where's the mic?
Hi, Zali. Welcome and well done for tonight. Two quick questions. One on NDIS. Do you think the current government is really doing enough to remove the fraud which is going on? And there's a huge amount of fraud going on in the NDIS. I talked to my local GP and he just shakes his head in shame. Now, there's 706,000 people in the NDIS at the moment. It's costing us this year 30 billion. And in 10 years' time, it's envisaged that the NDIS is going to cost us 100 billion a year. It's gone up 10.8% in this last year, it's 3 times the rate of inflation, and a lot of that is due to fraud. So I just wondered your views on that. And my second question, very quick one, is just on water. Climate is obviously one of your pet loves. We had a big drought here in 2007. We then had another drought in 2017-18. We were promised in New South Wales after 2007 that we'd have new dams built, we'd have more water storage built, we'd have a few other things done. Bring the clock forward right now. We've had nothing done. So if we get another drought, and Australia is a country of extremes, we've had a wet period at the moment, a dry one will come, our water reserves will go down quicker because we've got more people and we've had no extra storage, no extra dams. The Greens are stopping existing dams being raised, and everyone's going to say climate change, but it really is very awful water management.
Okay, well, I'll address both sides of that. So I'll address the second one first. In relation to the dams, the problem around some of those plans is the environmental impact was very real and concerns of whether they would actually meet the needs, and the cost was incredibly prohibitive. But we do need to plan on water. We need to look at desalination plants rather than just dams. But we are on the heating trajectory. We're due to probably 40% decrease in rainfall globally by the end of the century. So that will have a huge impact on continents like Australia. You're not going to just be able to fix it by building dams. It is going to be about water use. That is why I'm incredibly critical, for example, that a lot of water tables, for example, are given free access to coal and gas for gas extraction. We waste huge amounts of water in that way. So I think we've got to be really consistent in a concern for water. It is about creating the infrastructure, the dams, the desalination plants where they're identified as being needed, but it is also about valuing water as a commodity that provides life. And that does mean we cannot just allow fracking to continue that ruins water tables, and we can't just give free licence for the water to be used. It's also an issue with nuclear. Nuclear uses a huge amount of water. So I think we need to be consistent about that position. But I don't deny it's a huge problem. I think for WA, their investment into desalination plants is going to need to be considerable because of those shortages. 87% of the population lives within 50 kilometres of the coast, but our regional areas are really going to be hit hard by drought. There's no doubt about that. And so we do need sensible management of water, and you only have to look at complex plans like the Murray-Darling Basin Plan to just understand how difficult reaching agreement when it comes to irrigators, mining and environment. Getting the right balance is incredibly difficult. So in terms of dams, I agree that certain infrastructure is needed to make sure we increase dam capacity. It is about understanding the where and for what purpose. On the NDIS, has been in operation for 10 years, but unfortunately for a long time it was left to operate without much oversight. The Act provided for the review. The review highlighted huge amounts of excess. There is fraud in the system, and my understanding from the government is they are cracking down on that. It's not the only problem, though. Another area that's come up as a result of the NDIS is that state governments have deferred onto the NDIS costs that should be met by state governments. A classic example is around disability transport, for example. Having disability access on public transport is an obligation and a responsibility of state governments. They have failed to provide that in many, many situations. If I think of, for us, proper access for buses, when it comes to ferries, we have very few disability transport options, and many of the rail network isn't even properly accessible. And yet, for example, around then NDIS ends up having to provide within plans these incredible amounts for disability taxis, and there are very few, and people are charged ridiculous amounts. So it's about the review identified all these areas of waste where there are fraudulent behaviour, and resources were allocated to investigate and crack down on that, and I have been briefed on a number of areas where that has happened. It is looking at holistically as a system, is it sustainable? Because I agree with you, it is not on a sustainable fiscal pathway. It cannot continue to grow at that rate. And so the question then is, how does it get reined in? It needs to go back to its core principle and purpose of what it was established for. So looking at how people are assessed to be eligible to be on NDIS, and then who are the providers and what they have to do for compliance to stay on it. There's a lot of paperwork and a lot of duplication that ends up incurring a lot of cost. So trying to make it a more user-friendly service that recognises someone with a permanent disability should not have to renew expert reports at great costs on a yearly basis to establish the same thing again and again, or someone with a rapidly deteriorating condition should have a system that scales up quickly to address needs that change. It's an incredible support service, but it has to be fiscally responsible. So part of the review was really doing the early intervention pathway, which was for children, and the intent is that once a child has sort of had the assistance of NDIS, that they would then transition off NDIS support, that it's not a lifetime support, that it should do its purpose in assisting at that development time, that assistance at development stages make a huge difference. And then there are those with other, the more, the lengthy pathway in terms of disability. The briefings that I've seen, the numbers and indications from Treasury and the Treasurer, is the projected growth has been brought back down significantly, and that it is now a much more manageable fiscal model. Now, of course, we have to stay vigilant on that. But I do also recognise that it's an incredible service to many people in our community. And so finding that balance is going to be really important. And that comes back to the integrity piece of processes that hold it to account, clear review, clear accountability to make sure there isn't that wasteful spending. I mean, to give you a little example, locally, there is an NDIA approved accommodation in North Bargalla and Manly Val. Now, these are premises that have up to, I think it's 10 to 15 residents in one place. Instead of all of them having individual transport allocations because of their level of disability, an application was made to the NDIS by the provider of the housing for the purchase of a vehicle that could then service the needs of all the residents by using all of their allocation rather than keeping on repeating all the individual allocations. The system doesn't allow for that. So they're the kind of practical changes that I'm advocating for with the Minister. There has been a change of Minister now. Obviously, Bill Shortens has retired, so whoever forms government, there will be a new Minister. But these are the kind of practical changes that do ensure cost savings that I think need to be written into the model as they change. But I am also aware, having had a lot of contact from parents and people in the community, that it is an absolute life-saving support that allows families to continue, people on it to continue contributing to the best of their ability, which is the intent, and and families to be able to continue operating when there's a member of the family that needs support. So I think it's part of a sound Medicare, a sound NDIS. These are support systems that Australia is noted for around the world for being a country that does provide a significant level of support and from a health and wellbeing point of view to ensure our community has that support. So I'm conscious of the concerns around NDIS. I feel there's a balance has been struck by the current changes to the legislation, and I think vigilance is needed to maintain the fiscal responsibility around it. All I can say is when I've attended the briefings and they show me the columns of what are our biggest spends and where are things blowing out, our top 6, the biggest costs are health and hospitals, education, defence. Defence is going through the roof at a much higher rate than any other cost sector. And NDIS, ironically, was the only one that had come down from projection. So that's all I can say. I've got one more question. Okay, it's 5-2. Oh, okay, I'm sorry. Please, if you've got more questions, sorry, I talked too long. Please write in. We'll do our best to take questions on notice. I'll hang around to have a chat anyway. The recording of the session will be available on the website, and I welcome feedback and more questions always to the electoral office. We've had many an email. Thank you. Sorry.